Hi once again, listeners. This is Mark Griffin, Director of Customer Solutions here at Construx. We are a team of software engineering experts led by legendary author Steve McConnell. Here we believe every software team can be more successful at delivering higher levels of business value. In these episodes, we talk with one of our consultants, exploring one of the different types of engagements. We describe the issues those engagements were designed to address and how we solve them. And today we're picking back up with our second in a series of 3 podcasts that will delve into the world of Kanban, a topic that's pretty popular apparently from the listener feedback we've received. We're joined in the virtual studio ether once again by Jenny Stuart, Construx's VP of Consulting and a frequent Kanban instructor, consultant, and coach. And I welcome you back to the microphone, Jenny.
Hi, Mark. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So today's episode is going to focus on the nuts and bolts of setting up and operating Kanban systems, as well as some discussion on metrics associated with tracking progress. These elements have come up in many of our client conversations that teams have in organizing and running their Kanbans. And so as a quick framing note, let's define Kanban for our purposes here as a concept related to lean and just-in-time production, where it's used as a scheduling system that tells you what to produce, when to produce it, and how much to produce. And so in software, we're really talking about flow and throughput, right, Jenny?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, cool. So in the first episode of the series, we talked more in the negative sense, in the misconception sense, about some of the mechanics of setting up a Kanban system. So I thought today what we would do is recurse a bit and talk about those mechanics in a proper context of what to do correctly here first off. So at the very beginning, the very baseline, let's talk about work item types. In other words, what your team actually delivers. So getting that clearly described is super important, right?
It is. And surprisingly, this is often the hardest thing for teams to think about and figure out. And
well, that's surprising to me because you think like the what would be the obvious one.
Yeah, it surprised me too. When I first started working with Kanban teams, I always thought the workflow would be the hard thing to figure out. That's actually the simplest thing. The hard thing is to really step back from your work and think about your work item types.
So what would be some examples of work item types like for software teams in different contexts?
Sure. If you were, say, a Scrum team and we were Kanbaning you, maybe doing some Scrumban, I would think of that team as having the product backlog items as being their work item type. In that product backlog, they might have a variety of things from stories to defects to technical debt, but they have one requester, the product owner, and one location that it comes from. So I would think about them as having that as their primary work item type, or maybe their only work item type.
Okay. Well, how about other areas that we might connect with, like maybe like IT groups? What would there be a difference with those kinds of organizations in terms of what they have?
Yeah, absolutely. Couple examples there. One, I worked with a group who was doing kind of what they called project work. These were major initiatives that would often take them months to kind of complete. They were adding big new infrastructural elements into their ecosystem.
Okay.
And then they also had what they called keep the lights on work, which was just small incremental things to what you might think of there, keep that system running. So that team actually had 2 work item types, which we mocked up as 2 swim lanes in their Kanban board.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that happening, and we'll get into this as we talk further about the specific nature of IT work and sometimes the notion of swim lanes, and I think we'll touch on that as we go.
Yep.
So you have your work item types, right?
Well, one more thing on that I think is really important, which is the way to think about it is to kind of step back for a second and ask yourself who your stakeholders are. So who asks you for things and who do you deliver those things to? So for our Scrum team, obviously, we're going to think about our product owner. For that infrastructure team, they're probably thinking about there's probably a project request queue somewhere that people make those for, or the organization prioritizes the project. But the keep the lights on work might be prioritized by the leader of that particular team. So thinking about just who asks us for things and what kinds of things do we end up delivering to them is the big way to step away from. I think a lot of people, when they think work item types, start thinking about what they do to the work, which is really the workflow. And
yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. And so they get really thinking about what they're doing day to day. But if you instead step back and think about stakeholders and receivers, that will get you much closer to your work item types.
I like that. That's a good way to really think about it. And, I think the stakeholder thing, stepping back and thinking stakeholders, that probably makes people think a little bit outside the box once in a while and say, we got our noses down on what we're doing work-wise, but what actually are we delivering, right? So I think that's good. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is defining the workflow in terms of the steps that the work items go through and the stages you have defined for that. So give us an example of that as a way for us to kind of visualize what that means.
So here, this is actually the easy part. Once you've identified those work item types and for example, maybe you're a team who is doing enhancements, right? You're doing small incremental enhancements on an existing system. You've got a big pipeline that comes in that gets prioritized by a person. You simply ask, okay, when the work arrives, what's the first thing that happens? And they might say, well, it enters the queue, it gets prioritized. That's done by Joe, our engineering manager. Okay, that's a backlog. And then what happens? Well, we pull the piece in, we look at it, we make sure we understand the need. Maybe they put some acceptance criteria around it. Oh, that's an analysis kind of work. Yeah, but we call it investigation. Okay, so that's an investigate step. And then what happens? Well, and then we build it and we test it. Okay, that sounds like an implementation step. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. It's implementation. And then what happens? Well, we hand it over to our customers and they validate it. And then we're done. Okay, so you have a validation step and then you're done. And so their workflow would be investigation, implementation, validation.
Okay. And those names are standard names? The team can call them what they want to call them? What's your philosophy on that?
Yeah, I think the teams should call them what they want to call them, with one caveat. If I'm working with an organization and we're standing up or refining the implementation of a ton of teams, I will try and standardize the naming so that if everybody is doing kind of similar things, one team calls it analyze, another team calls it analyzing, and another team calls it investigation, I'm going to try and get us to align on a common name. So if stakeholders come and look at the diversity of boards, they won't just get confused by the terminology.
That makes sense.
I won't insist or tell them what the name should be, but I'll ask them to get together and agree on a name and let me know what they're going to call each stage.
That makes sense. And then I mean, maybe this isn't a leak into the third podcast we're talking about, but if you're going to roll this up, if you have many teams doing this and rolling them up into a higher level, then having some level of standardization at the lower level probably helps to do that. Right?
It certainly does not hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So now you have the items defined, the flow defined, but I suppose there needs to be some kind of agreement on definitions of the steps, like you call them work state policies, meaning things like what defines something in a certain state as being done, right?
Yeah. So here I'll usually think about two things. The first is going through each of those columns or stages in our Kanban board and talking about what the exit criteria are. So what does it mean to call the work done in the analysis step, done in the investigation step, done in the implementation or building step? And getting people here, we're going to be talking on the early parts of the boards. This would be very similar to like a Scrum style definition of ready. We've done the analysis, we understand it. Maybe if we're story pointing, we've story pointed and made sure it's at least a reasonable work size. We have any design information we need. We understand the need. In implementation, we're going to be talking about things usually like it's checked in, it's been code reviewed, we've run static code analysis tools on it. Those are the kind of things that I would expect in our exit criteria across the board.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, there's also things like board level policies as well, right?
Yeah.
Some more simple stuff, mechanical stuff.
Yeah, this is things that don't apply to any one stage in the Kanban system, but apply holistically. It might be logistical things like what time of day the team holds its daily Kanban, or it may just be kind of working policies that are the norms of the team, very akin to like Scrum's working agreements. For example, I had one team that got a lot of very small requests for work, things that were like pick up the phone and answer a simple question. And they were really concerned about Kanban because they thought they were going to have to put a Kanban ticket in for every single thing they did, and felt like if they were doing these 2, 3, 4 minute tasks, they'd be having way more overhead than they'd actually be doing.
Right.
And so we sat down with the team and with the manager and basically came to agreement on what it would be the threshold for adding work into their board, for adding a ticket to the board, right? You obviously, if you're going to spend 3 or 4 hours on it, that probably makes sense. So we came to an alignment and agreement that made sense for the team and made sense for the manager of the team, of saying that basically if something took more than 30 minutes, a ticket got created.
Okay, that makes sense. Chris, there's devil's advocate here where if you have a number of those that creep up and you ask different staff members on the team, it only takes me 10 minutes to deal with it. I don't want to enter it on the board. And they have 10 a week, then you've nibbled away at some of your bandwidth with that, right?
Yeah, you have. You have. And, when you can do things like on a daily or weekly basis, ask people to sort of say what amount of their work was spent doing this. Again, I would be kind of stepping back and saying, what do we need to understand about this team and what's the easiest way to understand it? Having them do a high overhead approach to understanding a problem versus a low overhead approach. I'm always going to take the low overhead approach.
Sure, that makes sense. I recall a conversation I had with one of our other technical service providers when he was asked to kind of do a little bit of coaching on their Kanban system, and I remember him saying that there was an awful lot of work that was not exposed, that was in process, that once they became honest with themselves about these little 10-minute tasks, these little 5-minute tasks, they ended up being a pretty significant amount of their time. And so I think that's in alignment with what you're saying, is you want to make sure you understand what that limit is.
Yep.
In terms of simple, quick things to do. So.
Well, and that kind of thing also, it makes sense to check in on, right? We thought it was this way, but is it really this way? Are these really 5-minute tasks, or are these tasks where it's 5 minutes to look at the email and an hour to actually do the work? And that really should be a ticket on the board.
Yeah, I could see that becoming a comedy act in a team. Yeah, that was another one of those 5-minute jobs that took me 4 hours. Right?
Well, that was basically what they said, right? They said,
sure.
If it really does only take us 5 or 10 minutes, let's make sure that we just do it and get it done. But the second it starts to creep over, right? And they're like, if it's not done in 30 minutes or less, preferably less, then we know this is morphing into something that's big enough. We want it to be on our board so that it's not invisible work.
Good advice. So the last thing on the setup side that I wanted to talk about was this, and we just alluded to it shortly here, is the work in process limits, or WIP limits, meaning how many of the items are allowed to be at each stage of the workflow. Why don't we get into that? That's a good one.
Sure. There's 2 ways that I coach teams to put in place WIP limits. One that is my absolute favorite and one that is my back pocket. I use it if I have to.
Okay.
So I use it if I have to back pocket option is what's considered individual WIP limiting, which just means that as a person whose work is on the board, I can only do so many things at one time. Typically, people will say 1 thing or 2 things. So I have 2 tokens, Mark, you have 2 tokens. If both of my tokens are on the board and I'm doing that, I need to get something done before I put my token on a new piece of work.
Okay.
And this I typically use when there's a team who really can't help each other out. So I was working with a team to set up their Kanban system, and they were supplying the tooling infrastructure to 4 large product development groups. So this was the group who set up Jira and Rally and the other tools needed for the software development process.
Gotcha.
And they had the one person who knew Jira, and they were the only person who knew Jira, and the one person who knew Rally, and they were the only person who knew Rally. So that case, because there's so little ability to help each other out, I used individual WIP limiting. Now, they do have an issue, right? What if the person who knows Jira leaves?
Oops.
So we also had some conversations about knowledge transfer and mentoring and working together so that there was at least a person and a backup person in every area, so they weren't quite so dependent. So eventually I told that team, I want you to move to more full, robust WIP limiting once you can work together more.
That makes sense. I mean, what was their response? Was that a well-received guidance?
Yeah, they were actually interested in learning things outside of their core areas. They thought that would be beneficial. And like
Cool.
any skill building opportunity, right? I can't go tell somebody they have to learn something. I'm going to be more like, well, it'd be good to do skill building. How about we go around, look at all the diversity of the work you're doing, and have people talk about what they'd be most interested in learning, and have us talk about what would be most useful to have a backup for, and see where we have overlap and see where we have holes.
No, that's a terrific response. So in terms of other things you might think about in terms of the mechanics of a Kanban system, and you talked a little bit about this earlier.
Let's make sure we talk about the real.
Oh, your favorite one. Oh, see, I got so enamored in your second path that it was like, that's okay. So go for it.
So
sorry, cut you off. Be aggressive. Shut me down.
What I really want people to do is set robust WIP limits where there's a WIP limit at each stage of the board. And so in our little example of our investigation, implementation, and validation board, we have a team of 6. Usually what I will find is we will start talking about, well, optimal WIP limiting would be kind of 1 per person. But that's often so far away from where they are today. Sometimes we'll kind of talk about and say, well, it would be great. We have 6 people. 6 would be wonderful, but we've got 36 things on our board today.
It's unrealistic, right? Exactly.
And so that just feels like it's just too much of a shift. And I'll often start teams out at 2x per team member.
Okay.
So they now have 12 WIP limits to place on the columns as they deem relevant. So now we're going to be asking questions like, what percentage of your time do you spend doing your investigation? What percentage do you spend doing the implementation? And what percentage do you spend doing the validation? And placing the WIP limits where we think makes the most sense. The other thing about setting them slightly high is, one, they'll see a huge productivity improvement just by getting from 36 to 12. That's going to really limit the WIP that they're working on so that things start moving through the system much more quickly.
Okay.
It'll give them the opportunity to kind of test those WIP limits and say, is that right? Should we have a few more in the investigation to make sure that's feeding the implementation stage so that we're flowing well enough? Or do we have maybe too much there and stuff is starting to sort of feel like it's piling up there and we can't consume it fast enough? So it allows them to adjust them. And then once they've gotten that steady state, when we start talking about metrics, we'll also start talking about kind of tuning the WIP limits, reducing them, and then seeing what happens in the metric data that we have. And we should see better flow as we get closer to 1-to-1.
Yeah, I can see why you might say that's your preferred system. It just sounds like a much better way to start. Right.
It also, if you think about individual WIP limiting, what it's really doing is making sure that you and I aren't overburdened. As individuals, we're not trying to do 5 things at once and therefore not getting anything done. But it doesn't help us think about the flow through the system and what we need to do as a team to optimize the flow of work from when we start it to when we deliver it. So robust WIP limiting gives you that sense of you're thinking more about it's not about me personally being optimally busy. It's about us together coherently working as a team to optimize our value flow.
And that's a good thing, the value flow. We'll come back to that. Let's bookmark that one for now. So another thing that you might think about when you think about WIP limits, and you think about particularly with stakeholders, where stakeholders, you think about it visually of those folks pouring requests into the system and the system consuming them, right? At some point in time, one of those stakeholders might say, you know what? Drop everything. You need to work on this now, right?
So never happens.
Never happens. And thinking like sometimes it could be all the things we want you to do now. But from the standpoint of the mechanics of a Kanban system, another element that you have talked about that's pretty important is this idea of classes of service. So why don't you kind of expand that one a little bit, and we can get into that.
So this is exactly what you were talking about. Is some work more urgent than other work? Do you ever have, say, the equivalent to the ambulance on the freeway, where everything else needs to slow down to clear a path to let that one piece of work move through your system much more quickly? Now, the first thing I will tell people is you always have an input queue or a product backlog or a backlog, and you can order that. So if that's enough, and just changing the order in the backlog gives you everything you need in terms of being able to work on the most important things, you don't need a class of service. You have a ordered backlog and you're using standard class of service in your system. It's literally when you start having things like, we have a hair on fire emergency, we need to stop doing what we're doing now and shift immediately. That's an Expedite class of service. And probably the most common class of service that I will see. But I bet you can guess what the risks of putting an Expedite class of service into your system are.
Everybody likes that lane.
Yeah.
I get my stuff done quicker.
Yep, I want to use that lane. And if you expedite everything, you expedite nothing.
Exactly.
So when I establish classes of services, one of the things we also said is a policy. So this is part of your board policies for what is allowed to enter the Expedite class of service. I had one team who said it's because it's a customer priority 1, severity 1, a service level agreement defect. So they had certain customers where they actually had policies about response times for critical defects. And so if those showed up, those had to be expedited because of that SLA that they had with the customer. But the funny thing about that team, it's an S1, P1 customer SLA defect, or Joe such and such tells us we have to do it, was actually their expedite policy, because they would have a person in the organization who would come and say, do this. And I said, well, if they say do this, do you have to? And they said, yes. I said, okay, that's part of your policy.
Yeah, pretty much.
But it's important to be thoughtful about this, because I had a team once, they provided software and systems and services for a hospital, and they had been doing this for years, and everybody knew who they were. So if somebody wanted something, they would just phone a friend and ask him for something. And so we instead put an expedite lane in, and together as a group, we said, well, the policy to get into the expedite lane is that you have to get Joe squared to agree. And the team had 2 bosses, Joe and Joe. And this sounds like it's really bureaucratic, but they were small. They sat next to each other. This was super easy. And so to get into the expedite lane, both of the Joes had to say that was more important work than what the team was working on now. Otherwise, it just went into the backlog to get ordered in with the other work. And they went from expediting 2 or 3 things a week to expediting 1 thing a month.
Wow. That's a progress.
Yeah. They felt like they could be a lot more focused. They weren't jumping. They were jumping when they needed to, but they weren't jumping just because somebody had called and said, I want you to jump. Instead, they would say, well, should we jump? and sometimes the answer was yes, but often the answer was no, that just needs to go high up into our backlog so that we work on it soon.
Yeah, I mean, the emergency context here, I think, is, you keep it in mind, is just because the fire alarm is there, it doesn't mean you need to pull it every day, right? There's things you can do to kind of think about how does this work, and it's another policy idea, right? I mean, maybe this is a good time to define service level agreements, right? We haven't really talked about that in any detail. I think we talked about it in a counter sense in the first podcast, but in this case, it ends up being a commitment between the service that's provided, meaning the Kanban team and what they're working on, and usually the business, right, the client. So it's an expectation, I guess, and how long will something take? And so, how do you model that on a board? What does it look like? How do you structure something like that when you talk about these things?
So you'll want to get some data underneath your feet before you really start setting your service level agreement. And when we get into the metrics, we'll start talking about gathering cycle time and using the cycle time data that we gather to have a pretty good sense for what our flow through our system looks like so that we can set an SLA. And usually those will be set along the lines of once we start working on an item to once you get it, our SLA is that it is, say, 15 days, 85% of the time. And so that means the vast majority of the time people will get it in 10 days or less, and it'll be the exception. There'll be some significant reason that we can probably talk to and explain pretty rationally for the 15% that are going to take longer.
Okay. So when you do these things, right, they have to be evident somehow on your visuals and your boards, right? What do you do to model that? How do you set that in play? If you're, say, for example, someone's going to use an Expedite lane, that's an explicit thing on your board that everybody can see, and that should be set up with an SLA with the organization at some point to say people, this is when this gets to this lane. You can't do this unless we've agreed on it ahead of time.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things here. One is what the board model looks like. So the most common way to do this is if you just have standard class of service and Expedite is you'd have two swim lanes. One swim lane would be for your work, and the next swim lane would be for the Expedite lane, and you'd have set a policy that explicitly says, here's what needs to happen for you to be able to be in the Expedite lane. Plus, most people will also say, hey, we only expedite one thing at a time. So there'll be a limit on how many things can be in the Expedite lane. And then if we have the data underneath us, then we would also have posted up near our board, or now that we don't have a lot of physical boards because we're all virtual nowadays, in some team area, we would have our data about what our cycle times, what our SLAs look like for those two lanes. So obviously the cycle time data and the SLA for the Expedite lane, one would expect to be shorter than the standard class of service. In fact, if you'd had a team who only had a standard class of service, and then you put it in an Expedite lane, you would actually see the SLA on the standard class of service go up. It would start to take longer if they were expediting much.
That makes sense. I mean, are there other approaches that people use to delineate these things?
The only other one, and I don't see it very often, is that people can use colored cards for different classes of service. And so there you'd have it all on one board, and you'd have, say, yellow would be your standard class of service. And if you use colors, generally the Expedite is silver. It's the silver bullet that gets to run through the system more quickly. And then you're going to limit how many silver tickets can be on your board at any one moment in time.
That makes sense. And it's hard to know that ahead of time, right? You you need to run some stuff, look at it, make some, just observe it, and maybe make adjustments as you go.
Yeah, although I will say, I almost always say we really should only be expediting one thing at a time. So if another Expedite item shows up, we are going to want to get that first one finished before we start the next one. So you can certainly, like everything in Kanban, you can explain to me a rational reason why that wouldn't make sense. And if I buy it, that will set it up that way. But I do want to, A, really limit how many things can use that lane, and B, limit how many things we can be doing concurrently, right? Because again, if we say you can have an unlimited number of things in Expedite, it's eventually basically going to become your standard class of service because everybody's going to want to go through that lane.
Right. That makes sense.
Or get their silver card.
In the perfect world, we're talking about flow and your visualization. Everything's moving, everything's fine. But in reality, when you run these things, you get an item that ends up getting blocked, right? Something happens. And so, what approaches do you recommend to handle blocked items when they do appear?
So I think of this as sort of descending order of desired implementation. So my first approach, well, we need to talk about how are we going to make it visible on the board. The one approach I do not like is having a blocked column, because you lose your understanding of where the work was when it got blocked.
Makes sense.
And so a really common approach, a lot of tools will let you do this, is that you can turn the card red on the board. So you have a blocked status that you put the card in. The card now takes on a red color. And my favorite thing is that anything that is blocked counts against WIP limits, because that really motivates and incentivizes us to unblock items really quickly. I have a lot of teams who are new to Kanban where when I suggest that, they get this look. And that makes me go, okay, they're not comfortable with that yet. Let's go to approach number 2. Approach number 2 is, okay, it seems like you're uncomfortable counting those against your WIP limits, but how about we limit the number of things that you can block on the board? So you can almost think about this as like, you've got a set of red magnets, and how many red magnets can you use before you should stop blocking work and start unblocking work, right? Can you block 50 things in your board? That's probably completely insane. Only blocking one thing? Okay, maybe that's not enough. Usually we'll get teams to say something like, well, if we have more than 3 things blocked or 4 things blocked or 5 things blocked, we really ought to stop blocking and start unblocking. So getting them to, the blocks no longer count against WIP, but at a certain point, you just ran out of red tokens. You don't get to block anything else. And this, again, is a really good thing to be a part of your system policy. How do we handle blockers?
Okay. I mean, you alluded to it a little bit, the fact that the team might get upset when something counts against their WIP, right? And particularly, I guess, in the sense that if something is beyond their control, so that's an external dependency, right? So is there a separate thought process you have for things that are just outside of the team's control?
Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is see whether or not there's some other things that we can do to either reduce the number of times things get blocked or reduce the duration they block for. So I had a group once who found a lot of the things that were blocking in their system were blocking because they'd have to reach out and make a request to a different IT group in the organization who stood up servers. And they said, that typically takes that team about 2 weeks to do. So what we said is, okay, how about in a weekly review of the backlog, we walk about 2 weeks ahead of us through that backlog and see whether there's anything there that should trigger a request to IT, so that once that's ready for us to pull in, that infrastructure is actually there and we don't have to wait for it. So I'm not necessarily going to change how they handle blockers, but there are a few situations I'm going to treat really differently. And the main one is, every once in a while, I'll run into a team who is pretty exclusively doing customer escalation work. And so they bring things into their analysis or their investigation or their research step, and they find they need information from the customer, right? They need a log that they didn't get, or there's some configuration item they don't quite understand and they need to get some clarification. They're still not able to reproduce the issue. So they reach out back to the customer. Okay. And I had a group this was 100% of their work. Any guesses on how long it takes a customer to get back to us when we reach out to them?
Yeah.
Whenever they deem it's important to them. So they would have things that would block for a day. They would also have things that would block for a week. And so in that particular case, they had the status field. It was called needs more information. And so we actually created a need more information swim lane. And we created some policies around that swim lane. So if something was blocked for that reason, it moved down into the needs more information swim lane, and it sat there until the information came back. And the policy was, once we got the information we needed, it needed a slot to come back into the main work lane. So there had to be a WIP limit for it to return, but it got first priority to come back. So instead of pulling something off the backlog, the needs more information would be the next thing pulled in as soon as there was availability. And we also talked about any policies about how long could something sit in needs more information. If it had sat there for a month and a half, was that okay? Or did that basically just need to get put into we think this thing is no longer important to our customer. If it comes back again, it'll be a new ticket.
Makes sense. I mean, you had a pretty interesting comical way that one of your teams kind of were indicating how long something sat in a unknown state, right? Or in this waiting state. What was that?
There was a team once that instead of using like turning a card red or putting a red, if you had a physical board, a lot of teams would put red stickies on top of anything that was blocked. And this team would actually take a bit of a banana peel and put it on blocked items. So they could literally watch the banana peel age in front of their eyes.
Well, that's you could take a picture of that, or you could that's a way to harass somebody you're waiting for information. Look, the banana is like black, dude. When am I going to get my stuff?
It's about to fall off our board.
And the team is really revolting because it's fruit fly season now. Please help us. That's great. Is there any approach that you would think about for blocked items that you just don't like? Is there something that teams have had that just there's a counter example that you say, don't do this?
I do not like a blocked column.
Okay.
And it's because you lose the state. And one of the things that I want to know is, where are we blocking most often and why? And so if I put everything in a blocked column, you can have things moving backwards on a board, which is weird. And B, you lose that. Do we get blocked mostly in our planning step, or do we get blocked mostly in our build step? And I'm a big fan of actually analyzing your blockers.
Okay.
So take like all your blockers from last month, and this means that when you put something that's blocked, you need to put in why it got blocked. And then you spend some time, you use like a mural board or a Miro board nowadays when you're online, you bring all of these in and you start clustering together based on cause. And then you look for ways to either reduce their occurrence or reduce their duration by putting other practices in place.
Cool. So, one of the things you probably want to do with that when you're looking at is are we having these things occur in the same place all the time?
That's right.
Right. And so that can be a good indicator for somebody in terms of why things are getting blocked. Maybe you focus on that given the data that you collect and analyze why that continues to occur at the same spot. Right.
That's exactly right.
Even if you can't reduce why they occur in the same spot, at least you try and reduce the duration that they sit. Right. Some way to do that.
That's correct. I mean, the best world is you get rid of that from blocking, right? Like my team that started going through its backlog and putting its request in early, so that was ready when they got there. So taking steps that you can to kind of completely eliminate it is awesome. If you can't, then reduce their frequency or reduce their duration or reduce a bit of both of those.
Okay. Makes sense. So let's move on to now that you've got the mechanics there, you're going to be running this thing. And let's talk about some of the things you deal with when you're running on a regular or daily basis. There's a daily stand-up in Kanban. It's not like Scrum, right? It's a little different.
That's right. It is a little different. And in fact, the latest release of the Scrum Guide has moved even the Scrum Daily to be a little bit more, I think, flow-focused, which I think is really awesome. So in Scrum, historically, we've asked the 3 questions. What did I do today? What did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And what impediments or blockers are in my way. In Kanban, we're not going to ask the 3 questions. We're not focused on what individuals on the team are doing. We're very, very focused on our flow. So we're going to start by looking at the done column and moving our way from the end of the board to the front of the board. And at each stage, we're going to stop and we're going to talk about anything that's blocked, anything that isn't moving the way it should. And here's where knowing things like the cycle time data for the whole system or your SLA that you have, and also people will often start to collect cycle time data by stage. So you know that on average things spend 5 days in this stage. You are doing your daily and you look at something and you say, it's day 6. Close enough, right? Day 10.
Yeah, then it's something's wrong.
Why is this still here in day 10? What's going on? And then people will talk about any other items or issues that they want to bring up in that stage. And we'll talk about those in each of the stages until we get up to our backlog.
That makes sense. I mean, I like the visual idea of that, of working your way backwards to see what things are doing. I mean, one of the things, I remember in the first episode we talked about was this idea of not starving the system, meaning that we're always wanting to have workflow into the system. What are some of the ways that polished Kanban execution kind of accomplishes that? How do you replenish that queue of work that's inbound? I mean, certainly with the Expedite lane, you probably there's no shortage of that. But for standard stuff, right, when the stakeholders are providing that stuff, what are some ways to continue to make sure that the stuff is healthy?
Well, if there is no absolute end to the Expedite lane, we might be sitting down and having a conversation if your policy isn't stringent enough.
Yeah, that's good.
Are you really expediting all of this? Do you really need to expedite all of this? Can some of this wait? So I'm always looking for those opportunities anytime I talk to people about their Kanban systems. But, the most common thing I see people using is that they have someone who orders that input queue or that backlog of work. In Kanban, the generic term we would use for that is a queue manager. So if the team has, say, an engineering manager who's doing that today, I dub the queue manager, continue on with your work. If the team already, maybe the organization has some Scrum in it, and so there's already a person doing this and they're called a product owner, I'm going to continue to call them a product owner. They're going to continue to do that job.
Gotcha. And that would make sense. I mean, in the case where there's not a dedicated role, do you advocate having sort of a round robin idea where someone, maybe monthly you rotate that out and somebody gets to play that role, or is that something that's just up to the team's comfort level?
Like everything in Kanban, I'm going to ask the team what they do today, and we're going to model that. And so if the team has one person who's doing it today, we're going to keep doing that. If they have some other forum, we're going to keep doing that. If it's a total free-for-all, then that's probably not working well for anybody, and we're going to talk about how to solve that. And my first thing would probably be to look for a queue manager to do it. But in some organizations, there are other approaches. So some organizations will hold a regular queue replenishment meeting. So on some rhythm, like once a week or twice a month, they'll get together and they'll look at the backlog of potential things for this Kanban system and identify what's the next set of things that they want that team doing over that 1 week or 2 week period. So it's a regular rhythm that happens, and you're basically putting enough into their input queue until the next queue replenishment meeting.
Gotcha. So that makes perfect sense, right? That you, if you have an individual role that's playing that role and they are able to manage that, that's a good way of doing it. If you need to have some more eyeballs on the problem, you bring other folks into a meeting context like that. Not that everybody wants to have more meetings in their calendar, but particularly in the Zoom world these days or team world these days. But I think that makes sense.
Yep. And then every once in a blue moon, you'll run around kind of a round robin selection where there's like 2 or 3 people who have a stake in the system. So my 2 Joes didn't do this, but they could have, right? It'd be like, all right, you pick one, you pick one, you pick one, you pick one.
Yeah. Yeah, and the more participation there, I think, the better in terms of having people at least have insight into what's being planned. So let's switch gears a little bit. Talk about the more steady state and looking into the box and optimization kind of stuff, right? You're humming along. Your team thinks it's awesome. Everything's going really well, but you still want to make sure that you continue to focus on making things better. Not only for the team and using the system, but also for the business, right? So the notion, the Japanese knows the word is kaizen, right? You change for the good. So how about we talk a little bit about how to optimize the system for both of those things, and what are your sort of key swing thoughts for that idea?
Here in a perfect Kanban world, the teams would just spontaneously have conversations about opportunities and identify possible changes for the future. But I find a lot of times if teams don't have a little bit more structure, at least to start, they often will just start Kanbaning and then keep going and basically be the same team 6 months from now they are today. And just like any agile methodology, I really want the teams learning, growing, and experimenting. Kanban has this wonderful idea of shallow to deep Kanban. David Anderson talks about this a lot, where shallow Kanban is just your Kanban board. It's the visualization of the work and nothing else. And so things like adding your policies and adding your WIP limits get you into more deep Kanban. And then at the deepest Kanban, we're really talking about a learning experimental Kanban system, where you're gathering data, you're looking at the data, you're making a hypothesis, you try an experiment, you run the experiment, and you look at the results of that experiment and then adjust. You might pivot, you might try something a little different, you might keep that and move on to something else. So for a lot of teams, we'll basically talk about, I want some regular approach to learning and growing and improving. I've had teams where they say, well, we're going to hold a 2-week retrospective, just like the Scrum teams around us that we see. We think that will work for us. I've had some teams who say, we will hold a retrospective if we haven't identified a change and implemented that experiment in the 2 weeks leading up to that time frame. So if something spontaneously occurs, then we'll be working on that. We don't need that reminder to have that retrospective because we're already trying something out. And then sometimes I have teams who will actually basically we are always experimenting. So their rhythm is, we run an experiment, we make a hypothesis, we say we need this long to collect the data. And as soon as that experiment is done, they'll start their next experiment.
Okay.
So there's lots of ways to do this. The real key is making sure that the team has agreed upon some way to learn. And I do find that often just saying, well, it'll spontaneously happen, doesn't happen. So, that team who said, well, we think we're going to be spontaneous, but if we haven't had something we're going to try in 2 weeks, we have a backstop of a reminder. At least something like that, I think, is helpful. And the last thing that I see, especially in really peer-heavy Kanban organizations that are using a lot of Kanban and that's their sole approach generally, is they'll put in place a monthly operations review. And this will include all of the Kanban teams in the organization, as well as all of the leaders and all of the stakeholders and consumers of these Kanban systems, to talk about the business context and anything that's shifted in that over the past month, talk about the team's performances and look at the metrics and the flow, and identify changes either organizationally or inside of the Kanban teams that they're going to be trialing out between now and next month's operations review.
That makes sense. And through all this, I think there's an inherent idea of maturity, right, in these teams, where we're clearly in the beginning, there may be more structured stuff where people kind of force some rhythm, and then eventually maybe there's a shift to more spontaneous where people begin to do their own. How are we thinking about doing better on our own? And it just pops up more as a groundswell Totally seems to me like that would make sense.
And I think that's a real sign of maturity, right?
Sure.
We have gone past doing the motions of something, right? I see a lot of teams doing the motions of Kanban or the motions of Scrum, but they're not really doing the inherent things that we want, like being ever growing, ever improving, and ever learning. And the more that we can just have that be a built-in part of the culture and we don't need the backstop of forcing functions, the better, the more mature that team is. That's a great sign.
Sure. It warms your heart.
It does. It makes me very happy. Now, I will say I love Scrum style retrospectives too. So if people want to use those, right, then I have that gives me no heartburn at all. It's just that, if you can be experimenting a couple times a week, your cadence allows you to do that. Why would I wait to experiment once every 2 weeks?
Absolutely.
Faster learning is always better.
Well, and I think when we talk about optimization, and here at Construx, we talk an awful lot, from our CEO on down about making, having decisions informed by data. So, really this whole environment is needs to be data driven. So the need for metrics is critical, right? So this notion of Kanban metrics and there are a bunch of different examples that are commonly in use with clients, and I know this is one of your favorite areas to talk about, right? So let's get into that. Let's talk about some of those things.
All right, let us do.
All right, so I'll throw the first one out just to get her started. Cumulative flow diagramming. Boy, that sounds awesome. Cumulative flow diagram. So what's that all about?
So that's a way of understanding what your relationship is between lead time, cycle time, and WIP. So maybe we take a quick step back and introduce a few terms here.
Perfect.
The first term that we'll introduce is the concept of cycle time. And cycle time is the time that it takes from when we pull the work off of the backlog until we finish that work. So on an individual item, the clock starts the second it's pulled off the backlog and put into the first stage, and it ends when it's pulled from the last stage and put into the done queue. And understanding and looking at that cycle time data will help you start to understand if your system's predictable. A lot of people will actually look at average cycle time, but I find what you really want to look at is cycle time distribution.
Okay.
How often is your cycle time, say, 10 days versus 11 days versus 12 days versus 13 days versus 22 days? Because that will tell you